It is now, 4 minutes after 10 in the a.m., and I have the great pleasure of being joined on the telephone from Washington, D.C. by Phyllis Bennis. Phyllis is fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. She's written several books on foreign policy, the Middle East, and elsewhere. Her brand new book just out, Understanding ISIS and the New Global War on Terror, a primer. Phyllis, welcome back to the Sunday Show.
Great to be with you, Philip.
The new global war on terror. What's new about it?
Well, the first thing that's new is that it's not being carried out by George W. Bush.
Oh, that's a good thing.
And, well, it is important because I think, many KPFA listeners in particular will remember that when President Obama came into office, promising to end the war in Iraq, to withdraw the troops, he did also promise to escalate the war in Afghanistan, which he did. He also said, and he did this in a memo to everybody who worked in the White House and the State Department and the Pentagon and anywhere else, saying, we would prefer not to use the term global war on terror. That was Bush's term. And we would prefer to use the term overseas contingency operations. That's for bureaucratic speak. And, what it reflects is a number of political issues, including the fact that some of the key founders of the global war on terror, the neoconservative militarists who really controlled the White House, the office of the vice president, the office of the Secretary of Defense, key posts in the State Department, etc., were neoconservative, those who preferred war, who wanted to go to war in the Middle East with the goal of remaking the entire region. Those people are still active. It's astonishing to me that press people continue to interview them as if they were somehow the wise old men. They're not almost all men, but they're mainly men, but the wise old people of an earlier era, as opposed to the people who got us into this mess, who should be, well, in my view, many of them should be in jail or at least on trial for war crimes. But what they don't need to be doing is being heralded as the smart people. But their influence still remains. They're thankfully not in control of these major components of government, but they do have a lot of influence in the media, in the punditry, in the right-wing think tanks, in a whole set of places. But they are not calling the shots, and the war that's emerging is somewhat different, both politically because of that and on the ground. The war is different in the sense that it's far more reliant on drone attacks, on an escalating drone war than before. So there's differences. But the key is this is still a new version of the global war on terror. We could call it global war on terror 2.0. We could call it the new edition of the global war on terror. We can call it many things. But what's key is it is a continuation of George Bush's global war on terror.
Well, Islamic State, which you're calling ISIS and the president calls ISIL, is now being characterized by Republican candidates, particularly Jeb Bush, as having been a product of the mistakes made by the Obama administration and the Clinton State Department when they decided to withdraw U.S. service personnel from Iraq very early in the Obama administration. And they're saying, Jeb Bush et al. Are saying, that this provided the opening for a new organization, ISIL, or ISIS, to fill the vacuum left by the withdrawing U.S. troops, and that, therefore, Hillary Clinton is essentially the founder, with Obama, of Islamic State.
Yeah, and the decision made by my brother to sign on to the agreement with the Iraqi government that we would withdraw all troops by the end of 2011, signed by the Bush administration, that doesn't count. That doesn't count. So, what I almost said George Bush, what Jeb Bush is saying is wrong on so many levels. It's one of these, how can I count the ways? So start with, whose idea was it to withdraw the troops? That actually wasn't President Obama's initial idea, although he had campaigned on it. He came into office with an existing agreement that had been already signed by his predecessor, committing the United States to withdraw all U.S. troops and all Pentagon-paid contractors from Iraq. President Obama quickly tried to persuade the Iraqi government not to do that. He wanted to keep somewhere between 10 and 20,000 U.S. troops in Iraq. The Iraqi parliament, to their credit, said, no dice. You haven't done us much good here. We want you out. And they refused to grant U.S. troops the immunity from being held accountable for any war crimes they would commit that would have made it possible to keep the troops there. So without immunity, President Obama quite reluctantly went ahead and implemented the agreement that his predecessor had already signed, sealed, and delivered, that predecessor being one George W. Bush. So first of all, it's way wrong on that count. But the more important rewriting of history here, the more important historical revisionism that Jeb Bush is carrying out, or trying to carry out, is the idea that ISIS somehow emerged in 2011 or in 2012. ISIS as an organization goes way back before that. ISIS emerged in 2004. It had a different name at the time. It was called Islamic State in Iraq, or for some it was Islamic State in Mesopotamia, the old name of Iraq. And it was one of many Sunni-dominated resistance organizations that were created to fight against Bush's U.S. occupation of Iraq, against the invasion and the occupation. Not because of the withdrawal, because of the invasion. And it wasn't the most important at the beginning. It was one of many, but it grew and it became more powerful. And in the period of the Iraqi civil war that emerged in the middle of the anti-occupation war, in the period around 2006 to about 2008, in that period, the Islamic State in Iraq grew. It became more religious than it had been early on. It was linked to Al-Qaeda from the beginning. It was called Al-Qaeda in Iraq early on, even before it was called Islamic State in Iraq. And it took on an even greater level of sectarian religious identity as a Sunni organization in the context of the civil war. In the later period, around 2010 into 2011, it was less visible in Iraq. It didn't disappear, but it was playing less of a role because the civil war, the sectarian civil war, had morphed again and was taking a different shape in Iraq in that period. When it became very visible again was not until 2012 and into 2013 in Syria, where it had already gone over the border and was now operating in Syria in the context of the Syrian civil war. So it has morphed, and it changed its name a number of times through those years, from Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, Islamic State in Iraq, Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, et cetera, et cetera. It's changed its name over and over again, reflecting changes in both the theological and the geographic basis of what they were doing. So that's the history, and this effort by the Jeb Bush campaign to say this is all about a response to the withdrawal of U.S. troops is simply to rely on a, I hope, failed notion that people in this country have absolutely forgotten that there was a massive Iraqi opposition that was both secular and sectarian. It was Sunni and Shia. It was powerful and it was weak in different periods and different parts, but it was a huge level of opposition to the U.S. invasion and occupation of their country.
Let's go back, though, and among the alleged virtues of the George W. Bush administration was something called the surge.
Yeah.
On the surge, General Petraeus was the architect of the surge, which was doubling down with sending more troops over to Iraq to put down rebellion. And among the Petraeus tactics was to make friends with Sunni tribal leaders, as they were called. They can put quotation marks around Sunni tribal leaders who had been totally alienated by the new government installed by the U.S. because it was Shia. And so this allegedly was a huge victory for fighting Al-Qaeda and Islamic State in Mesopotamia, going back to, 2008 or so?
Yeah, the surge. People like to talk about the surge a lot. The surge is an interesting period to look at, because the surge is actually only a little bit about the additional 30,000 troops that Bush sent at that moment. You know, you send 30,000 troops to a country like Iraq, and yeah, they're going to have an impact, and they did. But far more significant was this notion of what you referred to, Philip, as, you know, sort of trying to make friends with the Sunni tribal leaders. What they were really trying to do was not so much make friends with them, but buy them off. So what they did was to offer the Sunni tribal leaders, and crucially the militias that they controlled, a huge amount of money that the U.S. was going to pay them to fight on the side of the U.S. instead of against the U.S. So they would go after the extremists. They would go after Al-Qaeda. They would go after the Shia extremists. That was the idea, that they would stop them from fighting against the U.S. occupation and the U.S. occupation-backed government, and instead they would fight against other opponents of the U.S. and its proxies in Baghdad. So that was the idea of the surge, and it worked quite well. It was able to buy off a huge number of fighters who simply continued fighting, but kind of on the other side. When that collapsed was after the consolidation of Nouri al-Maliki, the U.S.-backed president in Iraq, prime minister. The decision by the U.S. to stop paying these Sunni tribes and instead assign that responsibility to the government, to the now new government of al-Maliki. Al-Maliki said, oh yeah, I'll pay these guys, but immediately stopped paying them and immediately escalated the sectarian nature of his Shia-dominated government. So that what happened was not only that the Sunni tribal leaders and Sunni communities didn't like the government because it was Shia, it wasn't some sort of abstract sectarianism, it was very concrete because that government became immediately incredibly sectarian in its practice, meaning it was carrying out mass arrests of Sunni activists, it was bombing Sunni communities. It wasn't just about denying Sunni Iraqis access to privileges or to jobs, although that was part of it. It was also about a huge upsurge in anti-Sunni actions by the government. So in that context, the value or the accomplishments of this surge-led Sunni awakening, they called it, collapsed. And suddenly you had a revival of the Sunni opposition, of which what is now ISIS, what was then called Islamic State in Iraq, was a very major part. So it's important to see the surge in a much broader way. One of the other things that was important about the surge is that it happened at a moment when the Shia opposition, led by Muqtada al-Sadr, a name that I think many of your listeners will remember from the bad old days of the mid-2000s, in the middle of the Iraqi civil war, he was the leader of one of the most powerful Shia militias that was fighting against the U.S. occupation. And in the midst of the surge, he announced a ceasefire, a unilateral ceasefire that took a huge component of the opposition off the battlefield. And the fourth thing that was so important about the surge, in terms of why people can claim that the surge worked. Again, it was not only the additional U.S. troops, and not only the Sunni awakening, not only the ceasefire of Muqtada al-Sadr, but the fourth reason was the civil war, this sectarian civil war that had been so bitterly fought in 2006 and 7 and 8, had largely accomplished what its perpetrators had wanted to do, which was to end the kind of mixed cosmopolitanism of Iraq and divide Iraq into sectarian cantons. So the big cities, Baghdad and other cities that had long been populated by everybody in Iraq, Sunni and Shia and Kurds and Christians and Turkomans and everybody, suddenly were characterized by walled sections where people from a different sect could not go at risk of injury or even death. So that had been achieved. It was a gruesome reality, but it led to a diminished level of violence because the violence had accomplished its terrible purpose.
It's 19 minutes after 10 in the a.m. You're listening to The Sunday Show here on KPFA. My guest is Phyllis Bennis. Her book is out, Understanding ISIS and the New Global War on Terror, a primer. Phyllis is going to be here in Berkeley in a month and a bit. On September 29th, she's going to be speaking at the Hillside Club here in Berkeley. I think tickets are available already, but they will be shortly if they're not already available at brownpapertickets.com, or you can go to kpfa.org. My colleague Mitch Jeserich is going to be hosting Phyllis that night, and I think a good time will be had by all, I'll put it that way. Phyllis is a great speaker, as you can tell, and the event sounds like a fascinating one. So again, that's September 29th, 7:30 p.m. at the Hillside Club in Berkeley. Phyllis, let's shift gears. Oh, I should say that coming up in 20 minutes, we're going to open the phones to your called-in questions and comments at 1-800-958-9008, 1-800-958-9008. That'll be 20 minutes from now. So let's shift gears, Phyllis, from Iraq to Syria and the civil war in that country that now I believe is about 5 years old. Initially, that civil war started with just rather innocuous, peaceful, free speech demonstrations, part of the Arab Spring that had sprung up across much of the Middle East, where young people were essentially putting up graffiti on the walls, calling upon the dictator of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, to allow free speech, among other things, and this was not tolerated and, in fact, immediately put down brutally, and everything took off from there. In the meantime, that civil war has devastated the country of Syria, and ISIS has become one of the dominant factions in that civil war. So elaborate on that, would you?
Yeah, the civil war in Syria is very much the centerpiece of the crisis that is burning the Middle East right now across the region. What began, as you say, Philip, as a nonviolent opposition movement very much tied to the other nonviolent opposition movements of the Arab Spring in late 2010, early 2011, very quickly morphed after its very violent suppression into initially a civil war, and then quite quickly into an even broader regional and global war in many ways. So we now see at least 8 separate wars that are being fought in Syria, and they're all being fought to the last Syrian. It's been devastating. The war has led to the deaths of somewhere over 230,000 people. So far, the majority are fighters. The largest proportion of them actually are regime fighters and pro-regime militias. Civilians have paid an enormous price, not quite as heavy as that of the fighters on both sides, but it's been absolutely brutal for ordinary civilians. And you now have, out of a population of somewhere around 28 million people, you have 10 million people who have been forced to flee their homes, of whom about 4 million are refugees in other countries, and about 6 million are internally displaced inside Syria. So the humanitarian impact of that set of wars has been absolutely nightmarish, and it remains so. There is going to have to be a diplomatic solution to it. The question is, how long does the fighting go on before that can succeed? And it's an incredibly difficult reality, because you have not only the civil war of many Syrian civilians, not the whole population, we should note, but a significant number of Syrian civilians who started by challenging the very dictatorial regime of Bashar al-Assad. You have the regional war for power largely between Saudi Arabia and its allies and Iran and its allies being fought in the context of the Syrian war. Parallel to that, you have the sectarian war between Sunni and Shia/Alawite, also led by Iran versus Saudi Arabia in the region, but fought on sectarian terms as well as the regional power terms. You have a global battle going on between the U.S. and Russia for influence over sea lanes, for example, which goes directly to the question of Russian protection of the Syrian regime to maintain control of its naval base at Tartus, while the U.S. is so determined to keep its military bases in the region, and particularly its Bahrain base, where the Fifth Fleet of the U.S. Navy is based. You have a set of wars going on within the opposition to the Assad regime. So you have a broad battle between secular, sometimes called moderate by the United States, although that's a definition that nobody but people in Washington seem to find very useful, of secular forces versus Islamist forces. Within the Islamist forces, you have the division between ordinary Islamists and Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And then you have some new divisions, even further within some of the most extreme Islamist forces. And now you have a new sort of battlefield emerging with Turkey's latest decision to move into a much closer alliance with the United States, which leaves the whole question of the Kurds and Kurdish rights very central to the war in Iraq. To the war in Syria. So we're looking at an incredible complexity of wars crossing each other across across borders. You know, one of the things that has become best known about ISIS is its position, and they're certainly not the only ones to say this, but they're the only ones who have ever actually moved to make it real, their refusal to accept the old colonial borders of the Middle East, the borders created by a French guy and a British guy, known as the Sykes-Picot lines, that were essentially drawn in the sand in 1922, and beginning in 1919 and finishing in 1922, at the end of World War I, when the Ottoman Empire had been defeated by new empires, that newly empowered empires, the British and the French in particular, who were going to take over all that land that had been part of the Ottoman Empire. And suddenly they thought, well, let's turn these into countries. What had been a kind of undifferentiated area called Arabia that had very distinct historical divisions within it. There were cities that were almost like city-states. There were regions, but there were no nation-states. There was no Syria. There was no Saudi Arabia. There was no Jordan. Palestine was an understood region. It wasn't a city-state. So all of a sudden, that was going to change, and these guys drew lines quite arbitrarily, and they brought in kings from the other parts of the territory to make sure that the new kings would be accountable more to the British or the French than they would to their local population. So the king of Jordan was sent off to become the king of Saudi Arabia, and somebody from what's now
the other way around, the king,
and the other way around as well. So you had a mess, and what we now have is a position by ISIS to say the Sykes-Picot lines are not valid, and therefore they're not binding on us, so we're going to cross those borders at will. And one of the things they did very early on was attempt to take control of the Syrian-Iraqi border so that it no longer really divides identifiably separate countries.
Well, they're talking about forming a caliphate. What is a caliphate?
A caliphate was the old term for a Muslim religious state. I mean, state is perhaps a misnomer because this was way before the era of nation states. But it was a governing body that was simultaneously a political as well as a religious body that ruled territory. So it was part of the old Ottoman Empire, included a caliphate within it that had religious leaders. This notion that a caliph, the leader of ISIS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, has declared himself the new caliph of this newly created caliphate. The idea that somebody can just take that on their own and declare themselves the new caliph, that's not such a historical thing. There used to be a process for this, which he basically said, nah, I'm just going to declare it, and then everybody else needs to declare their loyalty to me.
I've heard he was killed.
Well, there's been a lot of reports. He's been reported killed several times. There's reports that other people have been killed and then they reemerge. I think that the phenomenon of ISIS is in many ways more important than the identity of the existing known leader, particularly right now, because what we've been seeing is the expansion of organizations in other countries, in Egypt, in the Sinai, in Libya, in other parts of the region, groups that are declaring themselves to be part of ISIS, when there's no real evidence that they have any connection to ISIS other than having been inspired by ISIS.
Okay.
And because the name brings out such terror in the West, they grab it and use it and claim it for themselves. But it's not at all clear they have a connection, but it's looking like ISIS-like organizations are popping up everywhere.
Well, it's not just creating a panic in the West. I mean, it's creating a bit of a panic among people like me, and the huge article in this past week's New York Times front page about what has happened to captive women being brutally raped, and the fact that this organization is successful at recruiting via the internet young people from around the globe to come to Syria and Iraq to fight on the side of ISIS, and the brutality of the murders of NGO workers, people that are not combatants in any way, shape, or form, and the turning of captive women who are regarded as infidels and consequently can be raped, and they're taking phrases from the Quran and using them as a justification for raping women. It's
horrifying. It's absolutely horrifying. There is no question about the horrific level of violence that this organization is perpetuating. I think it's important to keep it in the context of an incredibly violent set of scenarios that are now underway throughout the region that are killing, in fact, even more people than are being killed directly by ISIS. What has made ISIS particularly so frightening and so horrifying is their pride, if you will, in having their violence be promoted up close and personal. This is what's different. You know, they're not the first to carry out beheadings. The state of Saudi Arabia uses beheading as their method of choice for capital punishment for completely nonviolent crimes. Other organizations, the Free Syrian Army, linked to the United States, backed by the United States, the day after ISIS so horrifically beheaded two Western journalists, the Free Syrian Army beheaded 6 captives that they were holding in the context of the war in Syria. So none of these things are particular to ISIS. What's different is they're putting them in our face and seeming to brag about them. That makes it so horrific. And the rapes, making that something they would claim is justifiable. You know, there have been huge reports of rapes across the wars in the Middle East, in the Balkans, in every war. What we're seeing in examples in the Central African Republic not too long ago. These are long-standing crises of what war means for the people where they're being fought. Again, the difference is with ISIS, they're trying to justify it, not to deny it, to claim it, to be proud of it. And clearly that's part of their recruiting strategy. But I think it's important to recognize that this isn't their whole recruiting strategy.
What is the attraction? Why would someone be attracted to that?
Some of it is that the people who are attracted to that violence are people who thrive on violence, and there are people like that in every society. Sometimes they're criminals, sometimes they're soldiers, sometimes they're probably politicians, who knows. But that's not the main thing. What mainly is the appeal is in the region, they are seen as evil, but lesser evils than, for example, in Syria, lesser evil than the incredible and powerful sectarianism of the Shia-dominated government in Baghdad. So ordinary Iraqi Sunnis, ordinary Iraqi tribal leaders, Sunni tribal leaders, and crucially, some of the most powerful and well-trained Iraqi military leaders from earlier eras who are Sunni have allied themselves with ISIS as the best hope for having some way to fight back against this sectarian U.S.-backed government in Baghdad. That's a very stark and shocking reality that we have to face. In terms of international recruitment, the horrific videos that we see on occasion, we see them too much. I wish people wouldn't use them at all. I'm on a C-SPAN program that was recorded a couple of weeks ago and is going to be broadcast tonight, and I desperately tried to convince them not to include two very short snips of ISIS videos, and they insisted on doing it anyway. I was very upset by that. I don't think we should ever be showing these things. But we also have to understand that besides those violent videos, they have other recruiting videos that are having some impact. They are recruiting families. There's one video that I talk about in my book that shows children at what amounts to an amusement park riding ponies and eating cotton candy. There's an interview with a British fighter who's arrived in Britain with his wife and two kids, and his newest baby had just been born in the hospital in Raqqa, the self-declared capital of the Islamic State. Now, what would convince somebody to go there? It could be somebody who just feels so completely disconnected from their society, feels they can't get taken seriously, they can't get a job. For many young people, young men in particular, we're seeing this in France and in Belgium, as well as in places like Tunisia, which has many young Tunisians have shown up in Syria. They end up feeling that they are unable to function in the country, even when they were born there. Second or even third generation immigrants that feel they have no respect. They are so dispossessed. They're desperate for a place that will be welcoming, and they're prepared somehow to deal with the violence and the extremism. There was a study done recently in the UK of several dozen young people who were recruited to go to fight in Syria with ISIS, and somebody managed to get hold of the records with Amazon of what books did they buy in the weeks before they went. The single most popular title was Islam for Dummies. So these are not people who are starting out as Islamic extremists. These are people who are desperate, and they're looking for something. And this is what they are finding. It's horrifying.
It's, 36 minutes after 10 in the a.m. here on the Sunday Show on KPFA. My guest is Phyllis Bennis. We're going to open the phones in just a few minutes at 1-800-958-9008, 1-800-958-9008. Something else that's different about ISIS than Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is sort of a nebulous sort of worldwide conspiracy, if you will, whereas ISIS really is a state. They actually govern in places like Raqqa and Mosul, Raqqa in Syria and Mosul in Iraq. And these cities, the garbage is collected, the schools are running, it is a state.
It is, and one of the things that, again, I think we have to look at, if we're serious about stopping this kind of extremism, and if we're serious about ending these horrific wars, we have to look very sharp-eyed, without hesitating, at what drives people to this. The fact that in Syria, for instance, people from a number of different militias have ended up shifting their loyalty away from a different militia directly to ISIS is because ISIS is paying higher salaries. In the territories controlled by ISIS, and we should keep in mind, ISIS now rules over somewhere between 5 and 6 million people between Iraq and Syria. This is not small potatoes. This is large-scale governance. They are moving towards ISIS because of stability that has been denied them. In Iraq, any place that can get steady supplies of electricity is a Garden of Eden, because Iraqis have been without massive amounts of electricity. They've been missing massive amounts of electricity. So they make
the trains run on time? Is that what they make?
The trains run on time, and when it's 122 degrees, as it routinely is in July, August, and September in parts of Iraq, having electricity to run a fan, let alone an air conditioner, is life demanding. You need that to survive. So all of this has to be taken into account. This isn't just, people want to be, people aren't taking anything into account and they're just going off because they can make money. There's a desperation that comes of war. This is a region that has been exploding for decades now.
Okay.
Because of the U.S. invasion and occupation, because of the Syrian civil war, et cetera, et cetera. And people are desperate enough to accept any level of extremism and even violent repression if they can count on some level of stability, if they can count on getting food for their kids, some kind of medical help. And that's why ISIS is recruiting not only fighters, they're recruiting oil engineers, they're recruiting doctors, they're recruiting teachers. There's a story in the British press about a woman gynecologist from the UK who moved to Syria to open up a pregnancy clinic for the wives of fighters in Raqqa. Now, we can sit here and say, why would anybody do that? And I don't know why she did that, but I can imagine that for a lot of people, they're going someplace where they feel like they're going to be important, where they're going to be respected, where their religion will be taken seriously, all the things that so many people in our countries, in the U.S., in North America, in Europe, other parts of the world, feel they do not have access to.
It's 40 minutes after 10 in the a.m. here on the Sunday Show on KPFA. I'm Philip Maldari. My guest is Phyllis Bennis. The lines are full. We'll let you know when there's an open line. The phone number is 1-800-958-9008, 1-800-958-9008. And we haven't gotten around. Donald Trump has a solution to all of this, but he can't tell us what it is. He really
I know.
He has
keep asking him, and he won't tell me.
No, he said they can't give away his secrets, but he can solve the problem. Of course, Jeb and the rest of them, Marco, they want to put boots on the ground over there. That'll solve the problem. And Obama's using his drones, and he's really solving the problem as well.
And he has boots on the ground, too. Let's not forget there are at least 3,500 pairs of boots on the ground in Iraq. We don't know how many pairs of sneakers belonging to CIA and Special Forces people in both Iraq and perhaps in Syria, as well as the drones, the planes, etc.
And they're all doing such a great job of solving the problem. Let's go to our first caller, Eid in Berkeley. Good morning, Eid.
Hi, good morning. I just like to say really we're totally misled by this bogus group. They're neither Islamic or state or anything, a bunch of garbage. Their followers definitely are a bunch of idiots. They are a bunch of idiots. You can brainwash anybody to anything. Islam doesn't tell people to behead people on TV or to rape women and children, to burn people alive. None of that's garbage. So their followers are misled idiots. I don't know. They probably have brain of an ant, maybe even less. But the leaders are paid agents. Really, they are. They fake. They paid agent for the new cons who are behind the whole thing. For Israel, the American military-industrial complex, they destroying the Middle East. Near all their victims are Muslims. I haven't seen them touch Israel, killing Palestinians every day. Haven't seen them doing anything anywhere. This is a bogus garbage, and we should call them, like the Middle East, people call them Daesh, which is a derogatory word for them. They're Muslims.
What does Daesh translate to?
It means as come if it was some derivative, but in Arabic it means Dawla al-Islamiyya, very much like what they call themselves, but in Arabic. But it also have second meaning of scums, the bloody scums. They're barbarians. These are evil guys.
Okay, Eid has been Eid is a regular caller here. Okay. Eid, you should give us a break a few weeks and then come back.
I will.
Okay, because you shouldn't call every week. Okay. But Eid makes some very good points, and that's
why. He makes some very good points.
Yeah.
I mean, I think what's clear is that whatever is the belief of the leadership of ISIS, their claimed belief, whether they actually believe it or not, is less important. What they claim as their belief is grounded in a 7th century version of Islam as they interpret it. Now, I'm not going to argue and say that's not what they really believe. I have no idea what they really believe. That's what they put forward. What's more important to recognize, and in the section of the book is done as frequently asked questions, and one of them is, what do people in ISIS believe? And I start out by saying, well, here's what we know about what the leadership believes. But it's important not to put too much credence on that, because it's clear that the majority of people who give ISIS power, whether it's the tribal militias in Syria, in Iraq, or foreign fighters that are joining them in Syria, do not necessarily share those beliefs. So there's a set of beliefs that are millenarian, that are, a bunch of things. And like any religion, Islam, like Judaism, like Christianity, all of the holy texts all have words and lines and paragraphs you can pull out of context that reflected what life was like in the 1st or 2nd or 7th century when all these books were written, and claim that it justifies something today. I think that's less important than what they're doing. It's fine to say they're stupid, they have no intelligence, whatever. That doesn't tell you what to do about it. And I think that we do have to be serious about what's it going to take to end the war in Syria? What's it going to take to end the attraction of radical extremist versions of religions, whether it's Islam, Judaism, or anything else, end that appeal to young people? It means that we have to look at what drives people to look for those kinds of dramatic, violent, extremist ideologies. And we also have to look at what's it going to take to carry out the kind of real diplomacy, the kind of real negotiations that are going to be necessary to end these wars. We hear whenever the word comes up, everybody sort of throws up their hands and says, oh my God, you can't be serious. You can't negotiate with these people. And the answer is, I don't know if we can negotiate with ISIS or not. I doubt if we can right now, maybe someday in the future, maybe not. But they're not the only player. We can negotiate with the people on both sides that are fueling this raging fire across the region. The president says over and over again, there is no military solution. He's right. And the unfortunate problem is that his strategy is completely based on imposing military actions that, from his own words, we know are not going to work.
Okay.
So we have to figure out how to respond to that.
Let's go to Brian in Santa Rosa. We've got to get... Brian, you're on the air. Oh, Brian is Brian there?
Here.
There you are, Brian.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good morning. Yeah.
Good morning.
So I wanted to put some counterfactuals out there to your guest.
What is a counterfactual? I've never heard that word before.
That is she's presented her opinion about what the problems are, why ISIS puts videos up, and how that affects recruitment, and I'm rebutting that.
Okay, go ahead.
I don't think that's correct.
Okay, Brian, go ahead.
I don't think they're doing it because there's hateful people or people who are unusual, sociopaths. There isn't any evidence that they're collecting a group of sociopaths. We have many incidents to look at where we have well-educated, not poor people, but upper middle class or upper class earners who turn to violence in the name of Islam. And I would say Nidal Hassan, psychiatrist, who killed his colleagues and potential patients at the Fort Hood shooting, is a great example. The 9/11 hijackers, all of whom were not from poor backgrounds, were well off, had a life ahead of them. They did this for a religious reason. And if we don't actually acknowledge that and address that there is a religious component here, that there's 1,400 years of Islamic conquest in the background of what we're experiencing today, we never will be getting to how do you solve the problem. We won't understand why Hershey Ali,
Okay, Brian, I think you're gilding the lily here. Go ahead.
No, I think Brian raises an important point. I think there are plenty of upper middle class, well-educated sociopaths in the world. Some of them are Muslim, some of them are Jewish, some of them are Christian, some of them are atheists. So that's not anything we disagree about. I don't think that everybody who joins ISIS is a sociopath. I must say I do think that somebody who can come up with any justification for raping a 12-year-old girl is pretty sociopathic, yeah. I do think it's important. Yes, of course there's an Islamic component here, and I spoke to that when I talked about what does the leadership believe. But I think we also have to deal with the political realities of Muslim communities in non-Muslim countries, particularly in the West, in the wealthy countries of North America and Europe in particular. That's something that affects our communities. It's not only a question of what is making ISIS more popular or what is making ISIS more powerful or any of those things. It also affects our communities here. But I think that it is important to recognize that ISIS is powerful if we look at Iraq, ISIS is powerful in Iraq because they don't fight alone. There are people joining them for their own separate reasons, whether they're sectarian reasons, whether they're survival reasons, for a set of economic reasons. People are choosing to join ISIS because they see it as the lesser evil. And I think that's what we have to be willing to acknowledge, because we can't necessarily change what people believe of their definitions of their religion, but we can and must change the conditions that our government is creating, funding, arming, and maintaining that lead people to feel that the government that we back, in this case in Baghdad, is so bad that joining a terrible organization like ISIS is a lesser evil. That's what I think we have to deal with.
I'm just still a little concerned about typing Islam as being somehow a religion of violence. I'm reminded of what happened not that long ago in Bosnia, where an army of Christians rounded up and murdered 7,000 Muslim men and boys and dug ditches to dump the bodies. That's what Christians have done. So I think it's an equal opportunity kind of activity of mass murder. But that's my opinion. Alicia's on the line from Berkeley. Good morning, Alicia.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for taking my call. On the subject of looking at what's causing recruitment success to ISIS, this may sound a little far-fetched, but just listen for a minute. I have a friend who researches causes of rape and has actually been invited to college campuses to talk to fraternities and so forth about rape and why it's possibly increasing. And she's told me that the most amazing thing to her was that a lot of these young men are telling her that due to the porno and the video games that they watch, they actually believe that this is how women want sex to take place, is through domination and control. And they were surprised to hear from her that this is not what women want. So I'm wondering whether, youth all over the world who've been raised on these videos and these porno films actually are looking for a place where this is, somewhere where this is an approved and encouraged activity.
Yeah, thanks for your comment. This was also something that was talked about in the context of the Bosnia War. There was a claim by Andrea Dworkin and others who were working on the issue of violence against women that it was pornography that really caused the level of rape by Serb soldiers. I don't really think it's that central to it. Can you find examples? I'm sure you can. But I think that wars create those kinds of power dynamics. Wars have given rise to rape forever, way before there was anything remotely resembling video games or pornography, for that matter. So I think that's taking us down a very minor alley, if you will. That's not the main point. The main point has to do with power. It has to do with the question of wars and occupations throughout this region that people are responding to. And they're responding in many cases desperate ways, in other cases overtly terrible ways. But I think that what we have to do is look towards what is it going to take to create the kinds of levels of negotiations and arrangements, political arrangements, rather than military defeat. You can't bomb terrorism. You can't bomb terrorism. You can bomb people. You can bomb countries. Sometimes you might kill a terrorist. But in the meantime, you're going to create new terrorists with every bomb. Because anybody that we identify, when the U.S. bombs in Iraq, for instance, say they get it right for a change. They get the person they're aiming at, and that person really is, let's say, an ISIS leader. And they bomb him, and then the U.S. says, yay, we got the bad guys. Well, the way it's seen in Iraq among Sunnis is, once again, the U.S. is bombing the Sunnis in the interest of the Kurds and the Shia. And it exacerbates, it doesn't end or even mitigate the sectarianism of what the government is doing, how it's perceived in the society. So I think those are the kinds of issues that we can and have to deal with. I think the issue of pornography is perhaps a secondary aspect, but it's not the one that I think is really driving this.
Let's go to Ron in San Jose. Good morning, Ron.
Hey, good morning. My question is, anyway, I was going to say that Ms. Bennis has done a lot of good work and a lot of good points this morning. I was going to ask her, is she familiar with Ron Paul, the think tank RPI, Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity, and all these wonderful authors that are writing that they put on this website?
I'm not sure. The website is called what?
Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity.
No, I'm not familiar with that one.
I think we're not going to go into Ron Paul's particular political ideology.
Well, no, it's not Ron Paul. There's a lot of good articles. What I was going to ask is, who's behind all this? The financing and the ideology.
Yeah, this is a very important point. The financing of ISIS is a crucial aspect that the U.S. and its allies can and are refusing to do a lot to change. They're making money from oil, because all of the major oil companies are perfectly willing to buy oil from the areas in Syria in particular. Syria is not a major oil producer, but it's a significant one. And almost all of Syria's oil territory is now in ISIS's hands. That has had a huge impact. They also are making money from taxing transportation across their territory. In that way, they're acting like a state. And the whole question of what it's going to do to stop that is going to take a lot of governmental intervention. The biggest source is money that's coming to them from the Gulf states, largely Saudi Arabia, but the other states as well. What's not as well known, what we haven't been able to document as much, is how much of that money is coming from the Saudi government, how much from various Saudi princes, how much from various wealthy Saudi individuals. But there's no doubt that a great deal of it is coming from Saudi Arabia.
Why would the Saudis be, we're almost out of time, why would the Saudis benefit by funding ISIS?
Because it keeps ISIS and some of their supporters out of Saudi Arabia, away from challenging the Saudi regime, which, if you remember, for example, what the position of Osama bin Laden was, and with the creation of Al-Qaeda, was very much identifying Saudi Arabia and the Saudi regime as the enemy of what they decided was the true version of Islam. And the goal of Al-Qaeda from the beginning was to get U.S. troops out of Saudi Arabia so that they could challenge the Saudi regime, and so that U.S. troops would no longer be defiling the holy territory. It was very much focused on Saudi Arabia. Well, for ISIS, this keeps them away.
And of course, Mecca and Medina are the holiest of holies, indeed, and they are in Saudi Arabia. Indeed. Phyllis, we're going to have to leave it there. Phyllis Bennis, fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, her brand new book, Understanding ISIS and the New Global War on Terror, a primer, is out in the bookstores. She's going to be in Berkeley in a month and a half, September 29th, 7:30 p.m. at the Hillside Club, hosted by Mitch Jeserich. Phyllis, thank you very much. I always learn a lot.
Thank you, Philip. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you for joining us here on The Sunday Show. I am Philip Maldari. I'll actually be on the air tomorrow morning, bright and early at 7 a.m., one last morning of sitting in for Brian on Upfront. Looking forward to that. We'll be talking about a possible new jail in Contra Costa and the murder of Hugo Pinel at Folsom Prison last week. I do want to thank Mickey Mays, who's been at the controls. Encourage you to stay tuned for Across the Great Divide with Kevin Vance coming your way next. I'll be back here next Sunday as usual, every Sunday 9 to 11. Have a good day, have a good week, and again, thank you for your support for community radio. Bye-bye.